Hi, welcome back to Elite Literary Book Group. I'm Rachel Beck, and I realized as I'm going back through my past videos that I'm, slowly updating and putting on YouTube, that I didn't mention one of my favorite parts of the book. And that, I think I mentioned it, but I didn't read this part specifically. And that's in chapter 11, when Atticus is trying to explain to Scout why he feels he has to defend Tom Robinson, even though everyone in the town is hating them for it. And this is something you might want to remember. I think there's certain lines in every classic that should stay with you. And if it is a really good story, and you did your part in really reading it and trying to understand it, it will always stay with you. And then, when you find yourself in certain situations, you remember, well, I have to behave with integrity because this is so near to my heart and I know better. I've studied this, I know this. And it does, change your character over time, which is another reason why children should learn literature and read it in school. But anyways, I won't go off on that today. Okay, so he says, Scout, when summer comes, you'll have to keep your head about far worse things. It's not fair for you and Jim, I know that. But sometimes we have to make the best of things, and the way we conduct ourselves when the chips are down, well, all I can say is, when you and Jim are grown, maybe you could look back on this with some compassion and feeling that I didn't let you down. And then this is the one that I would remember. This case, Tom Robinson's case, is something that goes beyond the essence of a man's conscience. Scout, I couldn't go to church or worship God if I didn't try to help that man. And she says, but you can't be right. How's that? Because of all these people say that you're wrong. And his response is, well, they're entitled to their opinion. So you see, in contrast of the chapter I'm about to discuss, chapter 15, where you see the mob mentality, the groupthink, the tribal behavior, opposed to individual thought. And this is something I think that I really wish this new generation would stop and consider. Because I think it would, I think cancel culture and that it's like just finding something to be offended about and finding it, intellectual, but it's like pseudo-intellectualism. It's not real. I mean, everybody could find ways to be offended. That doesn't make you special. But to look at different issues and not look first to see where my friends are deciding or where my political party is deciding, but where do I see myself in this? What do I really believe? What are my convictions? That's the individual. And where you see the group behaving and making up their own, it's like a collective ego that the people always behave a little bolder when they have a group. Like in class, you feel like with your peers you could be a little, smart aleck to your teacher, but if she says, all right, well, let's go out in the hall and talk about it, then they kind of go, they don't want one-on-one. But it's easy, it's just like, when people make comments and things like that on social media, their identity is hidden, they feel really big. But if you actually went to them face to face, they would never, And so I think that's, it's part of the problem is because we don't have enough people who are just individual thinkers. And even though he's saying, Scout, I know you don't understand this, but when you get older, you're going to look back after you've lived and experienced life yourself, and you'll realize, or hopefully at least you'll feel some compassion for what happened. And it will start to make sense to you. And that's part of just as she becomes a woman, as she becomes someone who's also had to deal with her own trials and tribulations, then it becomes clear that truth and God are together. You can't separate them. And so, if someone doesn't mind lying but believes in God, I really don't know how you can do that. I don't know how you can say it. Your body physically does not like it. It's against nature. And so it's not natural. We're not made like that. At any rate, okay, I'll get to chapter 15. So the chapter opens where Hecate is outside, and I think his name is D-Lynx is out there, and they're trying to warn Atticus that there's been rumors there's definitely going to be some trouble since, I actually got his name backwards, Link D's, is there. You'll see he comes back a little bit, and they are trying to warn Atticus about they have to move Tom Robinson to the Mockingbird jail, and it's sort of like hinting at a group of men who are like a political group. Maybe they're like the Ku Klux Klan, and one of those people who makes up that group is Mr. Cunningham, who we see in the very beginning, who is trying to pay Atticus with some vegetables because Atticus did some work for him. And then you saw the episode with the little boy and the one who put syrup on his food and that kind of stuff. So Scout's familiar with them. And so this is going to cause a little bit of a conflict within Scout about seeing Mr. Cunningham in a completely different light. But he's not really his full self when he's around these group of men. He has forgotten that he and Atticus have a relationship. He is basically in his party mode collective ego. And so later on, Atticus is going to say he's not all bad. He just got confused. He just thinks he's a white supremacist. But really, he's just ignorant. But at any rate, he shows up, and they show up with this kind of gang. And the interesting thing is when Atticus says he's leaving, the kids, or especially Jim, has a gut feeling, which kids do judge things very accurately in their gut feelings, and says, I'm going out there. He's going to get hurt. It was a Sunday. This idea that something was going to happen was known. Even Mr. Underwood, who is the town editor, he's like the sole newspaper guy. And what he does later on is interesting too. So, but he doesn't get enough credit, I think, as a character. But he, what comes after that's very significant, especially since he's the writer in the town. So we'll get that. We'll discuss that later. But he said, so at church they were all there, and they were, this was a Sunday, and Mr. Hecate was present, and she had wondered if he'd seen the light, because he didn't normally go to church, and neither did Mr. Underwood, and Mr. Underwood was there. Atticus sits by himself. He doesn't like to be with anyone while he's worshiping God, which makes a lot of sense to me. Again, he's not part of, I'm doing this because the group is doing this. I'm doing this because this is my time alone. For him to feel God's presence, and me too, I have to be alone. It doesn't work when other people are around. It's too distracting. Anyway, so they all come. It's late at night, and the group's comes up and says, you know what we're after. And they want to get a hold of Tom Robinson. And they say, where is he, Atticus? And he says, well, he's sleeping unless you woke him. And, he's like, why we're here. And it's just kind of doesn't flat out say this is what we're going to do, but it's a very threatening situation. And what makes it more threatening is the fact that there's a group of men. And it's the kind of group where they get comfortable being bad with each other. And they feed off each other. And anytime that happens, it's a mob mentality. It's a scarier thing because people will act and behave differently, like I said, in different circumstances. But finally the kids show up and, he's trying to get his kids to go back home. Jim, take them home. You shouldn't be here. And Jim refuses. And it's like, no, I'm not. And that's probably the first time Jim has ever just straight up said no to his father. And so that kind of shows, his maturity and his gut feeling about what could happen. And then all of a sudden it occurs to Scout that she sees Mr. Cunningham, and she says, "Hey, Mr. Cunningham." And she says, "I was just talking about your entailment. Entailments are bad." And she said, "I go to school with Walter. Remember Walter came and ate at our house? He's a good boy. I had to beat him up a few times, but he's a nice kid." This breaks the mob mentality of where in Mr. Cunningham, where his ego is. Sort of like all of a sudden he remembers himself because he hears a child and he has a child. And that's what changes and starts to make him actually, I think, feel ashamed. And, that's the point of having a child narrator. Wordsworth said that the child is the father of man. And I'm going to put my courses on the Catcher in the Rye, but the main thing about Catcher in the Rye is really about child innocence. It's about Holden Caulfield not wanting to grow up and wanting to be able to catch people before they fall off that cliff and become like the Mr. Cunninghams of the world and are unable to think of themselves, can only think of their own survival, their own needs. They become greedier. They become more desperate. But the child doesn't know any better. And therefore, the child is more of a pure, innocent, honest little form that hasn't been conformed into anything. And anything's possible still for the kids. So they can be completely themselves. So this is what breaks him. And he's finally, Cunningham just says, "All right, boys, let's go." Okay, so they do. And then at the very end of the chapter, Mr. Underwood, once they left, he said, "I had you covered the whole time." Mr. Underwood and a double-barreled shotgun were leaning against his window above the Macomb Tribune office. So Dill, Scout, and Atticus walked back home with Jim. And it says the very last, as they passed under the streetlight, Atticus reached out and massaged Jim's hair. His one gesture of affection. So, now we'll see what happens in chapter 16. Stay with me. Thanks.